In this video, we're talking about the pick tool and selecting objects or sub-elements of objects. The pick tool is found in the very first column and row of the tools. And if I hover over the pick tool, we get our flyout palette, and there are two different tools in here. Clicking on the pick tool, we can see in the tool options palette that there are several buttons to choose from to narrow down our selection. The very first option, which is on by default, is called auto pick. And you can see that there is a keyboard shortcut associated with that when you hover over each one of these. So you do have the option of changing the topological level with the keyboard to cycle through these quickly. On the screen, I have a mix of types of objects. Some objects are solids, some objects are solids with holes in them, which are still solids. Some objects are two-dimensional surfaces, some with holes in them, and then we have some open wires and even some point objects. So let's look at the different types of selections that we can do. By default with the pick tool, when you are on the auto pick option and you hover over an object, it highlights in red. And you'll notice that the entire object highlights because it defaults to selecting entire objects. And this actually goes for all of the topological levels, which we'll be covering soon. If you look up here in the tool options menu, you'll see several object parts available. And if we click on one of those and we hover over our objects, the elements that Form Z is expecting that we're going to click on also highlight as well. But we'll get back to those as we explore further in this video. Form Z is highlighting the object that it expects that you're going to click on when you're hovering over it. Now, if you have objects overlapping each other or are in tight quarters, this comes in especially handy when you want Form Z to pick the objects that you expect it to. Now, you can turn off selection highlighting under the Edit menu by turning off Selection Preview. Now, when you hover over objects, that doesn't happen. They simply highlight when you click on them. So if we click on an object, it selects it, and if we click off of the object somewhere else in the file that is not on another object, it will deselect that object. So if I click on an object here and then click on another one, you'll notice it just deselects the first object that I selected and then selects the second object. So by default, the pick tool is selecting one object at a time. And you'll notice as I go down this row here that it is selecting one object at a time. Many tools work with one object selected, and in those cases, you don't even have to pre-select the object. You just click on the tool and then select the object. That is called the post-pick method. So for example, if I wanted to mesh an object, I could click on the mesh tool, set my mesh options. Let's change this number down to something much smaller, like 2 feet, and then click on the object. And you can see it meshes that object every 2 feet. So that is called the post-pick method. The pre-pick method is when you want to pre-select multiple objects and mesh them all at the same time. In those cases, I would use the pick tool to pre-select objects. And if you want to select more than one object, that's when the Shift key comes into play. So if I click on the first object just like normal, then I hover over another object. So again, they're highlighting to let me know which object Form Z thinks that I want to select. And then when I hold down the Shift key, we get a little green plus next to that, and it allows me to add to the selection one object at a time. So I can add to, and then if I hold down the Shift key on an object that I've already selected and I click on it again, you'll notice we get a red minus to remove it from that selection. So selecting multiple objects is very flexible to add to or remove from your selection. So in this case, if I select these two objects, so this is again the pre-pick method, and now I run the mesh tool, I click to execute the mesh, and it meshes both objects at the same time. So that's the difference between pre-pick and post-pick. Pre-pick means picking objects before the operation. Post-pick means picking the operation first and then selecting the object to which you want to apply it to. The other method to select multiple objects is to use the frame option. So when I click and start dragging, you'll notice a rectangular frame is being drawn on the screen, and objects only become selected once they are fully encompassed by the frame. And so it can be very dependent on the view that you're in while you're selecting objects. So for example, if I wanted to select this row of objects right here, I might go to more of a top-down view to be able to select those. Or I could actually click on the top view button and I can select those objects very easily. I could select these objects in this column very easily by doing that. So you'll want to take that into account as you're doing it. So that was dragging left to right. That gives me what we would call a window selection using this frame selection option. Now if I drag from right to left, again holding my left mouse button down, you'll notice this behaves a little bit differently. When I cross my objects, they are selected. And this is very typical CAD-like behavior. If you're coming from a traditional CAD package, that's really where this kind of behavior was developed. Now this behavior can be modified using this pull-down menu up here in the tool options. I can turn it off completely. So now if I click and drag, there is no frame selection. The pick tool will only let you click on objects directly. There's no clicking and dragging to invoke a frame. And you can also go ahead and change these so that it works inside only in both directions. So left to right as it was before, and then right to left. Other options are to choose crossing from left to right, from crossing from right to left, or always crossing. So if I click on crossing always, it will do it in both directions. And this doesn't have to be from the top down. It can also be from the bottom up, and it can go in any direction that you desire. Let's quickly look at the area pick tool now just to show what's different about this one. So similarly, you can click and drag and you can get that same frame type of a selection, but there are other tool options in here as well. You can choose to turn on crossing or not with the checkbox. You can choose to have it select or deselect. You can also change the shape of the selection frame. So right now it's a rectangle. If I go to the lasso tool, you can see I can draw more specific shapes to grab objects that I want. This can be great for tight areas when you're really trying to narrow in what you want to select. And you can also choose the polygon type of area pick where you click several points to draw polygons, and whatever ends up inside that polygon gets selected. And if you want to confirm your selection, you simply double click, and that will confirm the selected objects that were chosen during the lasso selection. Back to the main pick tool now, let's look at what these different topological levels are. So like I said in the beginning, auto pick is the default choice, and that wants to select entire objects. And if you hold down the command key on the Mac or the control key on Windows, you get into what's called sub-element selection. So if I hover over the middle of a face, it highlights the entire face. If I hover over an edge, it'll highlight that edge that I want to potentially select. This also works for points. If you hover right over a point, you'll see a tooltip pop up that actually shows the point number that you are hovering over. And then if you click on it, it will select that point and it highlights in red. Same goes for these other topological levels. If I hover over a face with the command key held down and I click on that, it then selects that face and commits it to the selection. If I hover over an edge with the command key held down and then click on that segment, it will select that segment. So remember, this is all being done with the auto pick tool option in the pick tool. The last modifier included in the pick tool is what's called pick parade. And when you have an object with lots of different parts to it, none of these are super complicated, but if I just hover over the object and let go of my mouse completely, and you'll notice right now I'm hovering right over a segment in between two faces. Now if I tap the tab key, it will convert my preview from object to segment. And if I tap it again, you'll notice that my crosshairs are slightly lower than that segment, indicating that I may indeed want to select that face instead. So it's jumping between possible selections. Again, you'll want to use your mouse to click to confirm the selection that you wanted. Again, that's called pick parade, and it's invoked by hovering over an object and then hitting the tab key several times to see what your different options are. This can be really great if you are hovering over a really complicated object and you want to find a really specific selection inside of there. Now let's talk about different topological levels. So the next option in here is points. And if I click and drag a window, you'll notice it starts to select all of the points on the object. You can also hover over objects and click on those, and then using the shift key to add or subtract from that selection, you can do that as well. So the behavior works the same for modifying your selection once you start moving along, but using the points option, it is only ever going to select points. So if I click on the middle of a segment, I don't get a segment selected. Oftentimes you'll forget that this setting has been engaged and you'll wonder, why isn't it selecting the thing that I want it to select? It's most likely that you have a very specific topological level selected when maybe you were expecting autopick to have been invoked. A point occurs where two facets come together, and it's a little bit tricky to describe when we're dealing with smooth objects. With faceted objects like these over here, you'll notice when I drag a window selection, it selects all these points, and that completely makes sense. But on these objects here in the middle, where we have a cone, a cylinder, and a sphere, If I drag a crossing window over the cone, you'll notice when I zoom in that it actually selected the top point and the point where the circle goes around and comes back to itself. And that indicates where that cone's beginning and end actually is. And if you remember back to our primitives video, if I right click on this and say show controls, remember we can peel back that cone, and that point indicates the point at which that peeling can actually happen. The same goes for the cylinder. If I click on this point here, and if I click on this point down here, you'll notice that those 2 points are the same on the cylinder. Again, if I were to show controls on that cylinder, that would be the location where that peel back could actually happen. On a sphere, there are no points to choose from. It is simply a single face type of an object. So area pick when you are dealing with points works in a very similar way. If I choose the points topological level and using the specialized area pick tools before, I can select points in a lasso, for example. When working in a shaded viewport like we are right now, this happens to be shaded work mode, but the same applies in shaded full mode. We can select points as well as other object types. And when I do a window selection like this, and if I spin the object around, you'll notice that it's not selecting anything on the back side of the model. That's important to know because oftentimes if I wanted to grab maybe the back of this object, I can't do that from this angle in a shaded view successfully. So if I wanted to grab all 4 corners of that back side of the cube, I can't do that by dragging this window. So in cases like that, you may want to shift over to wireframe view mode. And you can get there by tapping Command W for wireframe or Command 3 on Macintosh or Control 3 on Windows to get to wireframe mode. Or of course you can click the display type button here in the top of the FormZ interface. Now if I click and drag a window, you'll notice it grabs all of the points all the way through the object. So that's a nice little tip for grabbing the backsides of an object. Of course, you don't have to drag a window. You could click on those points independently and then using the Shift key modifier to add to or subtract from your selection, you can do that just as well. It's worth pointing out that the Edit pull-down menu does contain some selection options, and they're located in this third tier where we have Select Previous, Select All Ghosted, and Deselect. These can come in handily because some of them actually have keyboard shortcuts associated with them. So Select All is Command A on the Mac and Control A on Windows, and Deselect is Option Tab or Alt Tab on Windows. So if I wanted to deselect everything here, instead of potentially just clicking off on my file, maybe I'm inside of an object and it's impossible for me to click off somewhere else to deselect, I can hold down the Option and Tab keys to deselect my selection. At this point, if you were making a very precise selection and you mistakenly clicked off of it and deselected it, this is where Edit Select Previous comes in handily. If I click on that, it will reselect the previous selection. The next topological level is segments. So if I click on the segments tool, it's only going to select segments. If I hover over an object, it will not highlight faces and it will not highlight the object, and it also won't highlight any points. So if I click on a segment, again, I can use the Shift key to select multiple segments on objects or on multiple objects. If I click and drag a window, it's going to capture any segment that falls within that window for a window frame. And if I click from right to left, it is a crossing style window based on my preferences. Next up is segment sequence in our topological levels. And if I hover over any one of my typical objects, a segment sequence, in this case, you'll notice it highlights the entire outline of this face. But the best way to illustrate this is really on these faceted objects over here. When I hover over these longitudinal or latitudinal rings around my object, you'll notice they entirely highlight. So that really defines what a segment sequence is really like. If I go over this object over here, you'll notice that they go in sometimes some pretty odd directions. So if I click on that one, for example, because it wasn't a straight line, it is the most obvious sequence all the way around that object to select. This can come in really handy, especially with subdivision surface types of models. The next one we're going to talk about is the face selection, and just like it implies, it selects a polygon face. Now we have several different types of objects here. Some of these are faceted and some of these are smooth objects. And you'll notice when I hover over some of these, it looks like it's selecting the entire object. But just as mentioned a minute ago, that is actually a single face. If I hover over the cylinder, it's selecting the face around the outside. Same goes with this one. It's actually highlighting just the face around the outside. It's not highlighting the top or the bottom. So the preview can be a little bit misleading potentially if you don't know what you're doing here, but once you know, it actually makes a ton of sense. So to select a face, you simply click on it, and again, you can use the Shift key to add deselections by selecting multiple faces. And a face could be a surface all into itself, or it could be the face of an object. So these objects here would be considered faces. And down here, I want to point out these specifically because these are drawn in two very different ways. One object is a smooth object, and you'll notice when I hover over this flat face on the side, it highlights as expected. If I hover over this face, it highlights as expected. And you'll notice the same thing happens on this object here. The difference is in the curving sections. In the curve of this object, because it is a smooth object, that highlights as a single face in that rounded corner, whereas on this object, it is a series of faceted faces that make this one up. If I change my topological level back to auto pick to select the entire object and look at the inspector for this object, you'll see that this is a smooth model type. And if I click on this object, this is a faceted model type. So it's important to be aware of the differences when it comes to picking something that you're expecting to pick. In some instances of object types, you may need to do multiple face selections or segment selections or point selections to get what you're expecting. So if I go back to the face command, I may have to shift click to add all of those faces to my selection, whereas on a smooth object, if I click once, it highlights that entire area that I can then manipulate. Similarly, over here with these spherical kinds of objects, I have three different spherical kinds of objects. Again, just with the face topological option selected, if I click on this object, it selects the entire thing because it is one face. But if I hover over this revolved sphere, each polygon is a separate face, and the same goes on this object here. And again, if I click on this with the AutoPick topological setting, we can see that this is a faceted object. This is also a faceted object, and this is a smooth object. So it's important to understand the kinds of models that you're building so that you get what you expect when you're using the pick tool. Like we discussed when selecting points, when you select a face of an object, again, it's only going to select faces that you can see facing you in a shaded display mode. So when I click and drag a window around these faces on this object, it appears as if the entire object has been selected, but if I roll around to the back side, you'll see that the three faces on the back of that cube have not been selected. So again, you may want to switch to wireframe display mode to actually select even on the back side of an object like that. Now in wireframe specifically, if you want to select a face, you'll notice that faces don't highlight when you hover over them like they do in shaded work mode or in shaded full mode. Again, if I hover over these, you can see they highlight in red, but in wireframe, they do not. And the reason for that is because there's no shaded face to actually click on for Formsy to know what you're trying to do. So in wireframe display mode, there's actually an option that gets checked here in the edit pull-down menu that says two-click face/outline selection. This is not turned on when you're in a shaded display mode, but it is when you're in wireframe. So if you click on two adjoining segments that start to define the edges of a face, it will then allow you to select that face when you're in wireframe mode. So no need to switch back to shaded mode to do so. So if I wanted to select the back face of this cube, I can click on two adjoining edges that define that outline, and I can select it while staying in the wireframe display mode type. So again, if I switch back to shaded mode and I look back under the edit pull-down menu, you'll notice now that the two-click face/outline selection option is turned off. Again, switching back to wireframe, looking under the edit menu, and it's turned back on. So that option, you could turn it off or on in either display mode, but it really makes sense in wireframe view mode, so that's when it turns on as a default option. The next topological level that we're going to talk about is holes. So if I zoom in on some objects here that actually have holes in them, you'll notice I click on that and it selects the entire hole. If I go underneath, you'll notice that it is selected all the way through. If I click on this hole on the cylinder and look on the top side, it is also selected all the way through. It's very handy to be able to select holes, and for example, I could go to the top to move those holes inside those objects. So I can do exactly that. It actually updates the holes in those objects. The last topological level that we have in the palette is objects, and you guessed it, that selects entire objects only. And it's worth pointing out right now that these objects in the middle here are actually what are considered point objects. They are not sub-elements of another object. So the way I created those was using under the guides menu here, which is in the top row of the second column, there's a tool to draw points. And you can click anywhere you want and draw points wherever you'd like. And those are objects that you can snap to later. So if I go back to my pick tool and click on the point selection option, you'll notice that these don't highlight, even if I drag a window around them. Those are not considered sub-element points, which the topological levels affect. If I drag a window over the end point of this line, for example, you'll see it selects that point. If I drag windows around these, they are not selected. Those are objects. So I'm going to drag a window and select those objects, or going back to auto pick, it sees those as objects. So it's just something to be aware of. Now there are two palettes that can help you select or recall selections. Let's talk about the Select by Criteria palette. So under the palette's pull-down menu, you can choose Select by Criteria, or I can type Option space to bring up my assistant, and I can start typing criteria, and you'll notice that Select by Criteria shows up as a shortcut to bring up that palette. This is a very powerful palette because it allows you to filter your selection based on these different criteria types. So for example, I could choose by topology, and I'm just going to move this off to the side and say select all of my solids, and then say clear and pick, and you'll notice it selects all of the solids in the scene. I can add to that by clicking on other options as well. So I can add surfaces and open wires, and I can say add to my pick, remove from my pick, or clear and pick, which basically means start over. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll notice it basically selects everything except my point objects, because these are all of the different types of objects I have. If I added point objects to my selection and I click again. So you do need to be aware that you add to your selection by choosing these, and to deselect those will remove them from your selection. So if I just wanted surfaces, for example, I can get rid of everything except surfaces, and then say clear and pick, and everything that is a surface type of an object then gets selected. Let's turn off topology types and let's look at object type. So this gets even a little more fine-grained. If I click on 2D wall, so not just surfaces, but actually 2D walls, so that implies right there that they are surface walls, and I say clear and pick, you'll notice it selects those. Let's turn that off. Let's go with spherical objects. Clear and pick, and it selects my two spherical objects, not my spheres, but the ones that were drawn using the spherical object tool. So these are very tool-based with the type of options that we have in here, and you'll notice that this is a fairly long list. So if you're really looking for something specific, you might want to drill down inside of that object types. Now we also have model types, so I can choose faceted or smooth, and again using the clear and pick, these are all of my faceted objects, and if I go ahead and choose smooth now, I'm going to clear and pick, and it will grab all of my smooth objects. You can also use number of faces as your criteria. So if I turn off model type and I say the minimum is 4 and the max is 50, and let's clear and pick, you'll notice that it selects the objects that fall within that criteria. Next we have the attributes tab where we can select by material. So let's go ahead and click on material, and let's choose purple and clear and pick, and you can notice it picks objects based on their material type. Again, you could select multiple materials to have those selected, but I'm just going to choose one at a time here. And you'll notice when I click on that, the two objects that are that material highlight. We can also filter by layer. In this file, I have 4 different layers. So let's see what's on layer 4, and let's clear and pick. And you'll notice those objects are all on layer 4. Let's go ahead and choose layer 3 and see what's on that layer. It's a great way to see which objects are on which layer very quickly, just by selecting those and looking at that selection. We also have an attributes filter panel here. And in here there are various attributes that may or may not be in use in the project. And you'll notice there's also a Boolean down here at the bottom for and or. Lastly, in the Attributes tab, we have a name field. Something to be aware of in this section of the palette. When name is selected, you also need to have one or more of the following filters checked: object, object group, material, layer, layer group, or components. You don't need the complete matching name. Partial strings are also accepted just as long as you have the appropriate selection in the Which pop-up menu just below, such as Contains. And lastly, we have a rendering tab up here, and you can choose based on different criteria that have to do with rendering in your scene. The last thing that I'm covering in this video is the Selection Sets palette, which allows us to recall selections that we've saved. A lot of times you'll create a complex file in which you need to continually select the same objects over and over and over again, maybe to swap them out for some other thing, or you want to change their material, or it could be a number of reasons, but you want to pull up that complicated selection again quickly. And if we go under the Palette's pull-down menu, we'll find Selection Sets there. It's also found over here in these shortcuts. It's this icon with the little pick icon on it, and you'll notice that that pulls up selection sets. And the other way to get there would be to use the assistant. Now, I have 2 selection sets already saved, and these are shortcuts to recall selections that I've made previously. So if I click on the check mark, you'll notice it selects all of my objects in my All Walls selection set. Whether they're 2D or 3D, I chose these objects and I chose the name that I wanted to save that under. I can add to that selection everything in my object types selection set, which are these 5 objects here across this second row. I can deselect as well. So again, a quick way to recall objects that I want to refer to quickly. In order to create a selection set, it's very simple. You just make a selection and then we save it. So I'm going to drag a crossing window across these objects here in this diagonal position. I'm going to hit the plus button. You'll notice it creates a new selection. I'm going to call this diagonal, hit return, and now those objects are saved in that selection. So I can deselect and I can click on the checkbox to reselect those now at any time. Now, if I wanted to add something to that selection, let's say I wanted to add these 2 objects for some reason to that selection. So using the pick tool, using the shift key to add 2 more things to my selection, I can then right click on my selection set and I can update from picked entities and will now include those. So if I deselect and then reselect using my selection set is now updated to include whatever objects I want. Those objects can be different materials, they can be on different layers, they can be different types of objects. It doesn't really matter as long as it is at the object level. You can't create selection sets based on sub-elements. So for example, if I pick some faces here and I try to make a selection set out of that, it'll allow me to create it and name it, but if I try to turn it back on, you'll notice nothing happens. So it does need to be at the object level. So those are the fundamentals of picking and selections in Form Z. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to get notified when new videos are released on this channel, click the subscribe button below and click the notification bell icon to get a notification when new videos are released. See you in the next one.